Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about my thoughts and feelings about Bleak House by Charles Dickens. So if you don't know, I have been hosting for the last year and a bit a read-along called the Mega Dickens Readalong, where we're reading all of Charles Dickens' novels in publication order, and the book for December 2023 and January 2024 was Bleak House, which I finished rereading a few weeks ago. I listened to this on audiobook rather than this physical edition, and I really loved it, as I always do. So today I wanted to make a video all about Bleak House. The first half or so of this video will be spoiler-free, and then later on in the video, when I get into spoilery territory, I will warn you. I'll also put a timestamp down below in the description so you can see where I'm going to get into spoilers. I'll leave some more information down below in the description about the Mega Dickens read-along, and I'm also going to leave a link to a series of videos I did a few years ago now, quite a few years ago now, when I was hosting a serialized read-along of Bleak House. So in that read-along we read the whole of Bleak House over 18 months, and I made a video on like every few chapters together. So if you want some really in-depth thoughts about Bleak House, I'll leave that playlist down below too. But for now, let's talk about Bleak House as a whole. So to begin with, let me tell you a bit about what Bleak House is about. Bleak House is a dual narrative novel, Dickens' only dual narrative novel. We're partly following a young woman called Esther in first person past tense, and then in the other chapters we're in a third person present tense omniscient narrator following a bunch of other characters. And Bleak House, it kind of revolves around this court case, this chancery case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce. A will was disputed many years ago. It's been going on for a long time, and we follow a lot of characters caught up in this, including an older man called Mr. Jarndyce and three young people who he is taking into his household: Richard and Ada, who are wards in Chancery, and Esther Summerson, who is partly our narrator, who has been taken on into Mr. Jarndyce's household as a companion for Ada. Bleak House is a novel about Chancery and legal disputes. It's a novel about crime, about poverty, about illness, about friendship, and about love, and it has so many fantastic characters in, and it's written so well, and it's just a wonderfully rich novel. As I've already said, I didn't read Bleak House physically on this reread. I listened to it on audiobook, and the audiobook I listened to was the one narrated by Miriam Margolyes, which was really fantastic. I have read Bleak House I think 6 or 7 times before, but I've never listened to it on audiobook before, I don't think, and this was a great audiobook. Someone on the Mega Dickens Readalong Discord server was saying that they had listened to an audiobook where Esther's chapters and the third person chapters were narrated by different people, which I do think would be really interesting. So I feel like the next time I listen to Bleak House, that would probably be something I'd be interested in trying and listening to, kind of seeing how that affects the style of the story. But leaving that point of interest aside, the Miriam Margolyes audiobook of Bleak House was really good. So to begin with my general thoughts, I really enjoyed this reread of Bleak House, but I will say that it is a Dickens novel that I know really, really, really well, so I don't feel like my thoughts about it particularly changed. So Bleak House, as I said, I think this was my 6th or 7th read. And then the only other Dickens novel I have read as many times as Bleak House is Our Mutual Friend, which I think I've read 7 times. So when I read that later on in the read-along, that'll be my 8th read. And Our Mutual Friend is my favourite Dickens novel of all time. Bleak House is not my second favourite. It's probably my 4th favourite, I guess, though I'll do a new ranking once the Mega Dickens read-along is over. But it's high up there for me, but it's one that I have happened to read a lot of times, partly because I studied it at university twice, once for like a module and once as part of my dissertation, and then also because of the Victorian serialised read-along I did many years ago. As I've already mentioned, I did one for Our Mutual Friend as well, but doing that kind of slow, intense analytical read where I annotated the book, and I very rarely annotate things, so that kind of means, I guess, that Bleak House is a Dickens novel that I know really well. It's probably the Dickens novel I know best after Our Mutual Friend, which means while I love this rereading experience, there weren't like any surprises for me. I know this book well, I know that I love it. It was just great fun to return to it. Throughout the Mega Dickens read-along, I have been reflecting on the chronology of Dickens's books, the order they come in, and what that can tell us about the books and how interesting it is to read them in order. Bleak House is an interesting one because it's kind of considered Dickens's masterpiece, I think. I think a lot of critics, I guess, think that Bleak House is Dickens's best novel. And certainly the university course I studied Bleak House on in first year was called Introduction to the Novel, and we studied 7 novels. and Bleak House was one of them. Like, I think that tells you how critically acclaimed Bleak House is. And obviously, like, Our Mutual Friend is my favourite Dickens novel, and I think both Dombey and Son and Little Dorrit would rank higher than Bleak House for me, but I also do totally understand why it is considered his masterpiece, and I do think it is amazing. It's interesting to look at in chronology, because the books preceding Bleak House are David Copperfield and Dombey and Son. So we have Dombey and Son, which, as I said, is my second favourite Dickens. I love it a lot. And Dombey and Son, for me, feels like a really big step up for Dickens. Like, it feels like a big step up from Martin Chuzzlewit and the books that came before. And then after Dombey and Son, we have David Copperfield, which is very different. It's Dickens's first novel in the first person. It's a much more, like, personal narrative, and it has quite a different feel from Dombey and Son. And then Bleak House is quite an interesting one coming after both those two, because it feels like a kind of step onwards from both of them, sort of combining the different things he was doing in both Dombey and Son and David Copperfield, because we have in Bleak House this kind of big sweeping narrative with a lot of different characters like we had in Dombey and Son, but we also have half of it in first person perspective from Esther Summerson's perspective, which kind of builds on those sort of more internal elements that we get in David Copperfield. It's also kind of interesting to look at themes cropping up in Bleak House that crop up in other books by Dickens later. Crime is something that is an element of quite a lot of Dickens books, but I do feel like you see an increased interest in that in Bleak House, and in quite a lot of his other novels later as well, so that's kind of interesting to think about. I also feel like the characterization and the themes and the plot and the structure of Bleak House are just really, really good. Like, I feel like it's just a technically brilliant novel, and I feel like, in a way, maybe the writing in Bleak House is the best. Like I said, I love Dombey and Son and Little Dorrit, and definitely Our Mutual Friend more, and I think Our Mutual Friend is quite as good as Bleak House, but I do kind of feel like maybe Bleak House is Dickens's most technically brilliant novel. Like, I feel like his use of the present tense is really interesting in those third-person chapters, and I feel like the writing overall is so rich and atmospheric and so interesting that, like, I totally understand why Bleak House is a lot of people's favourite Dickens and one of the most critically acclaimed ones. And that dual narrative between Esther and the third-person narrator is really, really interesting and really, really adds to the story. I also find it really interesting to look at in terms of gender. As I've mentioned before on this channel, I did my dissertation at university on how the presentation of gender changes over time in Charles Dickens's books, and Bleak House is a really interesting book to look at in terms of gender. It contains the only first-person female narrator in all of his novels, and it also contains the most central female characters so far of his books, I would say, both in terms of Esther being the central character of the book, and her being a woman, but also in terms of the other supporting cast of female characters around her. You know, Lady Dedlock is very important and very interesting. We have Ada, we have Caddy. There's a lot of other significant female characters in the book. And the way this book looks at gender, especially to do with themes of duty and work and what is considered appropriate work and appropriate responsibilities for men and women, is something I find really, really interesting. Sometimes frustrating, but very interesting. And I feel like if you look at specifically Esther and Richard as characters and the different way they as characters and the people around them approach what their lives should be and what their, like, duty should be because of their gender, that is really, really interesting. To move away from sort of talking about Bleak House in its chronology, I want to talk a bit about the plot. It is very hard to talk about the plot of Bleak House without spoilers, so I'm going to talk about the plot a lot more in the second half of the video, but I will say that I think the plot of Bleak House is exceptionally strong. It's interesting, I feel like on the Discord server, a few people were saying that they found the book a little bit slow. I think especially up to, like, the sort of 2/3 mark, there are some very big things that happen in the second half, the final third, I guess, of the story, and I feel like until you reach those points, I can kind of see that maybe it does feel slower, but I also kind of love it. And I do feel like all the individual strands of the plot are really clever and well done, but also the way they weave together and the way everything is kind of like connected and linked by Jarndyce and Jarndyce, that is fascinating and for me just works really, really well. I also do think, as I've already mentioned, that the dual narrative serves Dickens really well in Bleak House. Like, I really enjoy moving between Esther's narrative and the third person chapters and the very different feel those chapters have, and also I really enjoy it when we get to see a character in Esther's narrative and then in the third person narrative from a different perspective. Like, I feel like that gives us a good sense of dramatic irony, a good sense of like Esther as a potentially unreliable narrator in places. I just think that's a really fun element that Dickens adds into this book that you don't get in any of the rest of his books, because he doesn't have that dual narrative thing anywhere else. So I'm going to talk about the characters, because Bleak House is a wonderful novel in terms of characters. In fact, I started writing character names of all the characters I wanted to mention who I love, and there were just so many. I think Esther is a really interesting character, as I have already mentioned. She is a narrator for a lot of the book, and she is quite an unreliable narrator in some ways. Not that she's trying to trick the reader exactly, but she's very modest, and she thinks that she isn't very important, so she doesn't always tell us things that are important to her. Esther is also a really interesting character, as I've already mentioned, in terms of ideas of gender and duty. Esther is illegitimate, we learn quite early on in the novel, and partly because of this, and partly because she's a woman in the 19th century, she feels that she has to be like helpful to people all the time. So she talks a lot about her sense of duty and feeling that she must be helpful and useful to all of the people around her. And that for Esther, I think, is tied up very much with gender and also with illegitimacy. And that's something I find really, really interesting in her character. Richard is another really interesting character, and I really enjoy his friendship with Esther. It's quite rare to find a male-female platonic friendship in Victorian literature, and Esther and Richard's is explored really well. And Richard is another really interesting character to look at in terms of gender, because he is a ward in Chancery. He's sort of not sure whether he's going to inherit lots of money, and he's been told that he has to have a career ahead of him, but he doesn't really know what he wants to do. And the fact that he doesn't know what he wants to do and finds it hard to stick at a career is sort of, within the Victorian system, a failure of masculinity. And the way that Dickens uses Richard's character to look at masculinity in Bleak House is really, really interesting. There's also the wonderful Mr. Jarndyce, who I do love a lot and is a really, really interesting character. I love his eccentricity and his kindness and his generosity. I love the like weird phrases that he creates. I love the fact that every time things are a bit uncomfortable or uneasy or unhappy, he just says, "The wind is in the east." I love that he has a growlery where he goes to growl. It's so great. And I feel like Mr. Jarndyce is one of those Dickens characters who is both really eccentric and really weird, but also I completely believe in. I feel like he's probably Dickens's most fully realised eccentric, except for perhaps Jenny Wren in Our Mutual Friend, who is probably my favourite character in all of Dickens. But I feel like Mr. Jarndyce and Jenny Wren are two of those Dickens characters who are really eccentric, but also I just completely believe that they exist and I love them. There's also Mr. Tulkinghorn, who is so well drawn. There's Lady Dedlock, who I think is a fantastic creation. There's also Sir Leicester Dedlock, Lady Dedlock's husband, and I think Sir Leicester Dedlock is like my low-key favourite of Bleak House. I just really, really adore him. Another favourite in Bleak House for me is Mr. George, who I just really, really enjoy. And I especially enjoy his dynamic with Phil Squads, who is his sort of companion and servant, but they also kind of have like a little family unit. I also really enjoy Mr. George's friendship with a family called the Bagnets, who live nearby. I really love the Bagnet family. I think they're a great creation. I really love the dynamic between Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet, where Mr. Bagnet relies on his wife's opinion for everything, but he doesn't want to admit that. So he always just says to his wife, "Tell him my opinion," and then his wife gives her opinion and he's like, "Yes, I agree with that." I find that really enjoyable. Like I said, I've read Bleak House a lot of times and I know it really well, but before I ever read Bleak House, I saw the 2005 miniseries, which is really great and well worth a watch. I think it's a fantastic adaptation of Bleak House and it adapts it very, very well, very, very cleverly, does a lot of great things. But because I watched the 2005 miniseries before I read Bleak House, the first time I read Bleak House many, many years ago, quite a few of the plot elements and characters were familiar to me, but Mr. and Mrs. Bagnet are characters that aren't in the miniseries, because, you know, there's only so much space in a miniseries, even a really long one like that 2005 one of Bleak House, and so I feel like the first time I read Bleak House, I just really fell in love with the Bagnets because they were like a completely new discovery. I feel like I actually love Jenny Wren and Our Mutual Friend for quite a similar reason, because again, I watched the miniseries of Our Mutual Friend before I ever read the book, and Jenny Wren is in that miniseries, but she is completely different different. Like, they changed her character quite substantially, and therefore Jenny read in the book was like an even more wonderful discovery. I find it quite interesting. The first few Dickens books I read, I had watched miniseries before reading the books, and I feel like that did kind of influence how I read them and like what bits I especially loved. One of the things I really enjoyed was like spotting differences between the books and the miniseries. So things that were especially different or things that had been cut, I loved even more. Anyway, I feel like that was a long tangent. Other people I love in Bleak House, Mr. Guppy is excellent. I feel like Mr. Guppy is just like the Mr. Collins of Bleak House, but I love him more and I find him very entertaining. I enjoy Mr. Woodcourt, I enjoy Ada, Mr. Skimpole is a really interesting character. I love Caddy Jellyby and Prince. I enjoy Mr. Snagsby. I love Joe. Joe is an excellent character. I haven't even mentioned Mr. Bucket, the great, excellent detective who appears in Bleak House and is a really complex and great creation. There are just so many characters in Bleak House to love, and I love them all. Before I move on to talking about spoilers and plot, I do want to spend a bit of time talking about the themes. I feel like Bleak House has a lot of really interesting themes. One, as I've already said, is obviously kind of the law courts and the problems of the 19th century legal system. And social criticism surrounding the courts of chancery is really vital to this novel. Dickens criticises the chancery courts, both through Jarndyce and Jarndyce, but also through different figures involved in different cases, such as Mr. Gridley and Miss Flight. And Dickens basically is telling you again and again throughout Bleak House that this system is not fit for purpose, that it is ruining people's lives. Family, and especially found family, I'd say, is also quite a big theme in Bleak House. The central kind of family unit of Bleak House is quite an odd one. We have Mr. Jarndyce and these three young people who have come into his household, but he hasn't really adopted them. It's a bit more complicated than that. Ada and Richard are his distant cousins, and Esther is there partly as companion to Ada Clare, partly kind of as housekeeper, and partly as like a member of the household. And that is quite a complicated setup, but they do form a unit that is kind of like a family, and definitely for Esther, it is kind of the first family that she has had and the first place that she's belonged in. I also think Mr. George is quite an interesting character to look at in terms of found family, because him and Phil's squad, as I said, kind of form a family, a social unit. And then he's also very close to the Bagnet family, and they kind of form another family for him. And these kind of found family units are shown to be very positive. And while we do have some positive examples of more kind of nuclear families within the novel, such as the Bagnet family, we also have two kind of nuclear family setups which are really dysfunctional, the Jellybys and the Skimpoles. Another really interesting theme in Bleak House is a theme of work and duty and kind of how those things tie in together, and also how they tie in with gender. I've already spoken about this a little bit in terms of Esther and Richard's characters, but I do feel like Richard's struggle to settle to work and how that for the Victorian world is kind of a failure of masculinity, and Esther's need to kind of always be helpful to people, which is very much tied up with gender, I think. These two things are really, really interesting in terms of the very different ways these two characters conceptualize work and duty. The way Dickens writes about work is always really fascinating, and it's definitely very fascinating in Bleak House. Another theme in Bleak House is definitely illegitimacy. As I've already mentioned, Esther is illegitimate, and we learn this very early on in the book. There's a line, I think it's in Esther's very first chapter, where Esther repeats to the reader something her godmother once said to her: "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers." I guess not all modern readers will necessarily get the Victorian connotations in that sentence, but every single Victorian reader reading that sentence would have known that meant that Esther was illegitimate. And at this point in time in the Victorian period, there was still a very big stigma, a very big taboo around being illegitimate. So actually, the very fact that Dickens chooses to have his narrator be an illegitimate woman who is a very good person and who is like very morally pure, that is actually kind of radical, which is kind of cool. Anyway, we know that Esther has been brought up quite harshly by her godmother and kind of kept apart from other children, but then we see that her illegitimacy makes no difference to Mr. Jarndyce, to Ada and Richard, and they really love her and embrace her. But I do feel that Esther's illegitimacy is really important in terms of looking at and understanding her character, because as I said, she is in Bleak House in a sort of odd position. You know, she's part resident, she's just part of the family, but she's also there to be a kind of suitable companion, we're told at the beginning, to Ada. And she's also kind of the housekeeper, you know, she has the housekeeping keys. And Esther basically feels that she always has to work and be useful. She talks a lot about her duty. And I think that's very bound up with her illegitimacy and kind of the fact that she's been taught from a child that she doesn't really have a rightful place in the world, and therefore she feels like she has to earn one, which I think is really, really interesting. Kind of related to the issue of illegitimacy is the issue of like identity and naming. Esther Summerson is called Esther Summerson, but she's illegitimate. Summerson is not really her name, and maybe that is part of the reason why she has so many nicknames. Throughout the book she has a lot of nicknames that she's given by other people, but also she gives a lot of people nicknames as well, and I find that quite interesting. And Esther is not the only character to kind of have multiple nicknames or multiple names. I also wanted to talk a bit about the themes of charity and generosity, because charity and what charity is and what charity should be is actually quite a big theme in Bleak House. Mr. Jarndyce is, I think it's fair to say, Dickens's model of a generous person. He is quiet and undemonstratively generous. He gives to individuals. If he sees someone in trouble, he helps them. That's what he does. It's all very, very personal, and he hates to be thanked. You know, there's a great anecdote somewhere in Bleak House about Mr. Jarndyce like jumping out a window to escape being thanked, which I find excellent. Then, in comparison to Mr. Jarndyce, we have two other figures who are very charitable, who are Mrs. Pardiggle and Mrs. Jellyby. They do a lot of charity work, but it's all kind of on a like organisational basis, and unlike Mr. Jarndyce, they don't really view the people they're helping as people. Mrs. Pardiggle is incredibly patronising and dismissive of the brickmakers that she is supposedly trying to help. As far as we can see, Mrs. Pardiggle does nothing to help them at all. She just lectures them and gives them religious tracts when there are, you know, things they need a lot more than that. And then Mrs. Jellyby has a mission in Africa that she's involved in, and we're told that it is all about, this is a quote, the cultivation of coffee and natives. And Dickens uses this phrase several times in the book, and I think this is actually a very important phrase. One, because of course Mrs. Jellyby's like charitable works is very much tied up with colonialisation, but also I think what Dickens is saying is that for Mrs. Jellyby, she doesn't really view the people in Africa that she's supposedly trying to help as any different from coffee. These people that she is supposedly trying to help, she doesn't actually view as people, and actually her charitable works are tied up with capitalism and colonialism and with the cultivation of coffee to enrich the British Empire. To be honest, I don't know how much Dickens is actually trying to be anti-colonial here, or whether that's just me reading into it, but I do think Dickens is trying to point out that Mrs. Jellyby, like Mrs. Pardiggle, is supposedly trying to help people, but she isn't really viewing those people as people. And Mrs. Pardiggle and Mrs. Jellyby also make their families very, very miserable by focusing all their energies on charitable works instead of looking after their families. To be honest, I've always really struggled with the way Dickens explores charity in Bleak House, because basically there is a gendered association of like men doing good works and that being fine. You know, it's fine for Mr. Jarndyce to help people, but Mrs. Pardiggle and Mrs. Jellyby shouldn't be trying to help other people, because what they should be doing is looking after their own families, because that's their duty as women. I do feel like that is the subtext, but then there's also a lot of other complicated subtext to do with what charity is acceptable, and you know, Mrs. Pardiggle and Mrs. Jellyby are not actually trying to help people, they just want to feel important. But also the reason why they do these things to feel important is because charitable works was like one sphere of Victorian public life that women were allowed to be active in, that it was considered kind of appropriate for women to be active in, and therefore I kind of end up feeling very complexly about Dickens's criticisms of their charitable works, because I feel like there are a lot of unforgivable things about the way Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Pardiggle try to practice charity, but I feel like the thing that Dickens thinks is the most unforgivable is the fact that they therefore spend more time away from the home than looking after their kids. I feel like that is the thing that Dickens thinks is unforgivable, and that is not the thing I think is unforgivable. And also, I'm not sure that I will ever quite forgive Dickens for the line Esther thinks when she first sees Mrs. Jellyby. Mrs. Jellyby had very good hair, but she was too much occupied with her African duties to brush it, because sure, her hair, that is the thing that's important here. Dickens. Anyway, okay. I went on a rant, so let's carry on. From this point on in the video, there will be spoilers, and I'm going to be talking about the plot in more detail. So if you haven't read Bleak House yet, please do head away now. I do feel like Bleak House has a great plot with so many interesting elements, especially in the second half. We have the storyline of Lady Dedlock and Esther, you know, the fact that Lady Dedlock had a child out of wedlock. I'm pretty sure her name rhymes with wedlock on purpose, but also she's in a deadlock, she's kind of trapped, you know. Dickens is great at names. Anyway, Lady Dedlock is Esther's biological mother. She was told by her sister that her child had died because her sister passed moral judgment on her, basically, and therefore she doesn't know about Esther until Mr. Guppy tells her. And I feel like that moment when she finds out is such a good chapter. It's so well written. We kind of see Lady Dedlock like have these like slow tiny reactions, you know, is she a bit pale or is it just the light in the room, and then the moment Mr. Guppy leaves the room we see her kind of break down. I think it's so effective, and I really love the scene between Esther and Lady Dedlock, the one we get between them when she says to Esther, you know, who she is. I also think Esther's illness is a really interesting element of the book, and the fact that following her illness Esther is quite physically scarred is really important. Like I said, I already feel that it's a bit radical that Dickens chooses as his heroine, but also his heroine is physically scarred, and considering the associations in the Victorian period of beauty and moral goodness, that again is quite an important and significant decision. In Victober 2022, I think, Tilly from Tilly's Shelf did a fantastic 2-video series talking about facial stigma in Charles Dickens, where she talks quite a lot about Bleak House. I'll link that down below. It's really interesting. But anyway, I think that Esther's illness and the scarring she has follows it is very interesting in Bleak House. There is some debate about what her illness might have been. I feel like it's sometimes assumed to be smallpox because that was very dangerous and could often leave people quite physically scarred. However, smallpox vaccinations were kind of like something that was happening at this time, so whether it's meant to be something else instead, I'm not really sure. Another fascinating occurrence in the second half of the book is Mr. Crook's spontaneous combustion, which is a really interesting element of Bleak House because it's one of those things that now we know is not real, it's not possible, but Charles Dickens did genuinely believe it was possible. He wrote this whole preface to one of the editions of Bleak House being like, yes, I promise spontaneous combustion does happen. I also think that Mr. Tulkinghorn's murder and the sequence that follows that is amazing. Like, I feel like that's some of Dickens's best, most gripping writing. Mr. Bucket is such an interesting character, and his arrest of Mr. George, that chapter where he tries to do it kind of kindly, but also it's a bit sinister, I think that's so good. Even just the very like shock of Mr. Tulkinghorn being murdered is kind of amazing. And then the actual solution is so good too. I find it really interesting. And then following that, Lady Dedlock's flight is a wonderful sequence. And I think Celesta's reaction to her flight is one of my favourite like things in the book. You know, it's quite clear that Celesta suffers from a stroke kind of in reaction to the shock of Lady Dedlock's flight. And then afterwards, when he's struggling to speak, he writes on the slate, "Full forgiveness, find." And Mr. Bucket knows what he means. And I think Celesta Dedlock is such a great character, and that sequence at the end is so well done because we see him throughout the book being this proud, you know, I'm about to say aristocratic, he's not, he's a baronet, but like semi-aristocratic gentry man who has this massive pride for his family. You think he would be, you know, so obsessed with respectability and family honour, but actually he loves Lady Dedlock and he doesn't care, and it doesn't matter to him that she had a relationship before their marriage, that she had a child illegitimately. Like, he just doesn't actually care because he loves her, and that is more important than the honour of his family. And I think that is great, and that like steady devotion of Celesta Dedlock is, let's be honest, the greatest love we ever see in Dickens. Okay, another element that I think is great in the plot is the solution of the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. You know, the fact that in the end a new will is found and the case is resolved, but it doesn't matter because all the money's gone. It's all been eaten up in costs. There is nothing left. And I feel like that just sums up Charles Dickens's point about the Chancery cases so well. The fact that this dispute has been going on for so long, that money has come out of it to pay lawyers and there's nothing left. And it's really great because it's such a shock in the book that the money is all gone. But it kind of shouldn't be, because all the way back in chapter 8, Mr. Jarndyce says to Esther, It's about a will and the trust under a will, or it was once. It's about nothing but costs now. And that's true, it's about nothing but costs. That's all that's left. And I think it's such a great but tragic ending. Poor Richard. I also want to talk a bit more about Richard. I've already spoken a bit about him, but I think he's a really, really interesting character, and his kind of journey is really interesting. Richard serves a lot of really interesting kind of social critique tools. He's both a symbol of, you know, what chancery suits can do to people, but he's also kind of a symbol of, like, middle-class men being taught the wrong things in Victorian society. You know, we hear about how he learnt a lot of great Latin verses in school, but that hasn't equipped him for life at all. And the three careers he goes through, medicine, law, and the army, before deciding that none of them will suit him. You know, those three things, plus being a clergyman, were basically like the main respectable professions for middle-class men in the Victorian period. And Richard kind of tries and fails at them all because he hasn't been equipped for them by his schooling, by his education, and by the hopes that he has for the future. Once again, I do feel like every Dickens book could kind of be called Great Expectations or Our Mutual Friend, because Richard is basically led astray by his great expectations. He has expectations, but nothing else, and therefore he can't settle to anything in life. And that is really, really interesting. We basically see over the course of Bleak House, over just a few years, Richard turning from this, like, bright, cheerful, affable boy to this man who has been eaten up by false hope, and it's really, really tragic, but it's also really, really good. Thinking about Richard's death made me think that there is a lot of death in Bleak House. From the beginning, we know that a former suitor in their Chancery case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, Tom Jarndyce, committed suicide. We also have the death of Mr. Nemo / Captain Horden, Esther's father, Lady Dedlock's former lover, who takes an opium overdose, presumably by accident, but we never really know if it's by accident, whether that's suicide or accident, we never really know. We have Mr. Gridley, who is kind of worn down to death. And we have Joe, the crossing sweeper boy, who dies of the same disease, presumably, potentially smallpox, potentially something else, that has left Esker scarred. Although actually, basically Joe dies of poverty. He dies because he has slipped between the cracks of society and no one ever helps him. I do feel like the death of Joe, the crossing sweeper boy, is possibly Dickens's best death scene, and I just think that way he ends it, where the third person narrator suddenly, like, addresses the reader, and, like, the world around him is fantastic. Dead, your majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead, right reverence and wrong reverence of every order, dead men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts and dying thus around us every day. Joe becomes in Bleak House a symbol of all the poor of the Victorian era and how neglected they are, and it's fantastic. There's also Mr. Crook, who, you know, dies of spontaneous combustion, as we have already established, wild death. We have the murder of Mr. Tulkinghorn. We have Lady Dedlock dying of exposure after she has run away from home and goes to the graveyard where Captain Horden, her former lover, lies in an unmarked grave. We have Richard dying from disappointment and weakness, and it's just very, very, very good. Oh, Bleak House is such a good book. I also wanted to talk a little bit about Mr. Bucket, because he's a really interesting character, a really interesting detective, and another interesting character to look at in terms of duty, because there are moments in the book where he says, you know, I have this duty, but I don't want to do it. I don't want to arrest you, Mr. George, but there is lots of evidence that you might have murdered Mr. Tulkinghorn, so I'm going to have to. It's my duty. And that kind of tension of duty and friendship is really interesting in Mr. Bucket. And also, he's very interesting because he's a very, like, nice, affable person in many ways, and he's, you know, very kind to Esther the night that they are chasing Lady Dedlock. But also, does he kind of drive both Joe and Mr. Gridley to their deaths by making them move on when they are far too ill to do so? He kind of does a little bit, doesn't he? And that really changes how you think about Mr. Bucket as a character. That tension, again, of duty and morality, very, very fascinating there. But I haven't yet spoken about Esther's two love interests in the book, her guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, and Mr. Woodcourt. And this is very, very interesting, I think. And I think the relationship between Esther and Mr. Jarndyce is something that quite a lot of readers struggle with in the novel. There is a very big age gap between them, probably at least 30 years, I guess. Esther is in her 20s and Mr. Jarndyce is in his 50s. And he proposes to her in the second half of the novel after she has been ill, after she has been left physically scarred. They're both kind of aware that at some point Ada is going to marry Richard and they will be left alone in Bleak House, and they couldn't be left alone in Bleak House, that would be improper, and Mr. Jarndyce asks Esther to marry him. And I think it's really interesting to look at why is Mr. Jarndyce in love with Esther? Or does he want to help her and basically find a way to legitimise their found family? When Esther talks about marrying Mr. Jarndyce, she talks quite often about being the mistress of Bleak House, not about being Mr. Jarndyce's wife. And I think in many ways, that is the way both of them sort of think about it. It's him offering her a home and a position in society. And for Esther, who is an illegitimate woman and has been left physically scarred by something like smallpox, actually the status of being the wife of a man who owns a place like Bleak House would be something that within the Victorian world she lives in, she would probably struggle to attain. And in that way, I think Mr. Jarndyce partly proposes to Esther to protect her and to, as I said, legitimise their found family and allow her to stay in this home that she loves. But I also do think he is in love with her. And I think there are a few moments earlier on in the book where Esther refers to him as a father or a father figure, and he looks pained. And I think that he is in love with Esther. That's my reading. But I think he also wants to help her. And I think in a way he phrases it to himself and she phrases it to herself as her being the mistress of Bleak House to make it easier for both of them, because I think he is in love with her and I think she isn't in love with him. I think she does love him, but not in the way she loves Mr. Woodcourt, obviously. We did discuss on Discord the fact that it's a bit weird and a bit icky that Esther continues to call Mr. Jarndyce guardian after they're engaged. But I think that is for two reasons. One, I think partly because Esther is struggling with the changing nature of their relationship and is a bit uncomfortable with it, potentially. But also I think because his very act of proposing to her is sort of to guard her. It is to protect her. It is to give her a position in society and to give her a place to live and a home and a life. But then at the end of the book, Mr. Jarndyce gives Esther up to Mr. Woodcourt because he loves her enough that he wants her to be happy and knows she would be happier with someone else. And yes, it is a bit annoying that Mr. Jarndyce arranges Esther's life for her and she doesn't really have a say in it. As older characters do it for younger characters in other Dickens novels as well, actually. But I kind of let it slide because I love Mr. Jarndyce so much and I really, really like him. I know a lot of people do struggle with the Mr. Jarndyce-Esther plotline because of the big age difference and the sort of complicated power dynamics between them. You know, she is living, sort of working in his household, and he has a lot more sort of power and class in the world. But I do think it's done really well, and I believe all the emotions and feelings of the people involved. And we'll also say, for anyone who did enjoy this plotline and find it really interesting in Bleak House, but would be interested to read a novel that explores a similar dynamic more, I'd really recommend An Old Man's Love by Anthony Trollope, which takes a bit of a similar setup, but that is the only thing the book is about. That is a really interesting book that I think was probably inspired by Bleak House. Maybe it wasn't, but if you enjoyed the Esther Jarndyce Woodcourt dynamic in Bleak House, you might find An Old Man's Love really interesting too. I wanted to talk a little bit about Esther and Woodcourt before I get to the end, because I do really enjoy their subtle love story. I enjoy Esther's sneaky narrative unreliability where she doesn't tell us much about Mr. Woodcourt because she's being modest about him, but also the little she tells us so much. I have forgotten to mention, at least I have not mentioned, that Mr. Woodcourt was the same dark young surgeon whom we had met at Mr. Badger's, or that Mr. Jarndyce invited him to dinner that day, or that he came, or that when they were all gone and I said to Ada, "Now, my darling, let us have a little talk about Richard," Ada laughed and said, "But I don't think it matters what my darling said. She was always very merry." Excellent. And later there is also my low-key favourite scene in the whole of Bleak House where Caddy brings Esther some flowers that have been left behind, and when Caddy says they're not from Prince, Esther says, "Oh, you must have two lovers then." Caddy says, "Oh, do they look like that sort of thing?" And then later we learn that Mr. Woodcourt has left them for Esther. "Do they look like that sort of thing?" said Ada, coming laughingly behind me and clasping me merrily around the waist. "Oh yes, indeed they do, Dame Durnan. They look very, very like that sort of thing. Oh, very like it indeed, my dear." Finally, the last thing I want to say is that Bleak House has an unusual ending where it ends mid-sentence. Here is how Bleak House ends. "My dear Dame Durden," said Alan, drawing my arm through his, "do you ever look in the glass?" "You know I do. You see me do it. And don't you know that you are prettier than you ever were?" I did not know that. I'm not certain that I know it now, but I know that my dearest little pets are very pretty, and that my darling is very beautiful, and that my husband is very handsome, and that my guardian has the brightest and most benevolent face that ever was seen, and that they can do very well with that much beauty in me, even supposing. End of book. Great. I really enjoy that the book ends mid-sentence, because I feel like it's very Esther to be like, even supposing I was pretty, but I won't mention the fact I was pretty because that would be immodest. Like, I just really enjoy it. And there's kind of a question brought up towards the end of the book in terms of whether Esther's scars have faded or whether Mr. Woodcourt loves her and doesn't care. And I think the point is kind of that it doesn't matter, because beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and there are much more important things than your physical appearance. And, you know, it's a lot more important to be good than to be beautiful. And I feel like that kind of builds on themes Dickens looked at a little bit in David Copperfield, to do with the fact that a lot of women in Victorian society were only valued for their beauty, which, you know, is not the be-all and end-all in life, is it? And I feel like Esther is kind of tied up in Dickens exploring issues of beauty. Like I said earlier, I did my dissertation on how gender changes over time in Charles Dickens's books, and I wrote quite a lot about Dickens's depictions of physical beauty, and how his emphasis on physical beauty as a valuable thing for like a romantic partner kind of really fades a lot over time. Like, his earlier books have a much greater reverence for beauty, and his later books are quite critical of that reverence for beauty, which I think is kind of cool for the Victorian period, which, as I said, was a time when beauty and morality were definitely like associated together in an uncomfortable way. Anyway, I feel like I have been rambling on for quite long enough, and I have to go and get a train, so I'm going to stop this very rambly video now. Please do let me know down in the comments what your thoughts were on Bleak House. Did you enjoy rereading it? What did you think about any of the things I've said today? What did you like? What did you struggle with? How are you getting on with Dickens so far? And that is all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.